2.
All right. Hello, everybody out there at LudoNarraCon. Thanks for coming to our panel here today. We're going to be talking about shocking developments, telling unexpected and maybe subverting player expectations with game stories. It's great to be in this session again, talking about that. I guess I'll introduce myself first. My name is Richard Rouse. I'm the creative director at Farbridge, an indie studio where we're working on some dark new worlds amongst a bunch of other projects. In the past, I worked on the Suffering horror games, and then I worked on State of Decay while at Microsoft, and I shipped an indie game called The Church in the Darkness, set inside a religious cult that you can find at LudoNarraCon, as it happens. So that's me real quick, and I will hand it over first to Heather.
Hi, my name is Heather Albano. I've been a narrative designer and game writer since 2009. Most of those years working as an independent contractor, which means I've worked all over the industry, indie and AAA and everything in between. I'm currently working for Deep Silver Volition on the Saints Row reboot that will be shipping in August. But I have done Amazon Alexa games that you play with your voice for earplay, and I've done tabletop role-playing supplements, and I was a writer on the procedurally generated RPG Wildermyth, and I have done a whole bunch of work for Choice of Games, which does text-based multiple choice branching path interactive fiction. And the work of that I am most proud of is a study in steampunk, which also happens to be on sale on Steam for the next few days.
Excellent. Anthony, do you want to go next?
Sure. I'm Anthony Johnston. I am best known these days for Atomic Blonde, the movie that was based on my graphic novel. But in games, I have written titles such as Dead Space, several games in the Dead Space series, actually. Zombie U, I worked on Shadow of Mordor, CSR Racing, and then most recently, last year, Resident Evil Village, where I sort of made a return to survival horror, if you like. I also write novels, role-playing game supplements, same as Heather, and a whole bunch of other things, screenwriting and what have you as well. But yeah, I've been working in games for, well, ever since that first Dead Space game, continually. So I'm looking forward to this.
Excellent. And last up, we have Zolivir. You want to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Alvery Nelson Jr. I'm a studio head and narrative director. I've worked on over 60 games in the past 6 years, some of which include Reigns Beyond, an airport for aliens currently run by dogs, Space World Organ Trading Simulator, Hypnospace Outlaw, just dozens and dozens of things. And I also walked out of a dentist's office 15 minutes ago, so half of my face, the one in the light, is fully numb. So if I make a weird expression, if my words don't come out right, or if I don't look as properly stoked as I should be being on this awesome panel with these panelists to talk about surprising stories, now you know why.
We've had our first shocking development of the panel, which is Zolivir's emergency medical situation. But glad to have you here. And I was just curious, maybe start off with Anthony. You mentioned, you've worked on a bunch of franchises, from the Dead Space starting off all the way up to Resident Evil most recently, where you may be trying to tell a story in a world that's already established by other people or that's had a bunch of entries in it before, and you're like, how can I possibly tell a new Resident Evil story, for example, at this point? How do I do something new with this that is going to keep surprising people, even though there's been so many entries? And I was just curious, do you find that, what are the unique challenges, I guess, of working in other people's worlds and keeping things surprising?
Well, the way I approach this, there are two halves, if you like, to answering the question. One of them actually kind of runs counter to the title of the panel, which is that it's not always the best thing to do something that's different for the sake of it being different. That has to be paired with a sense of taste, I suppose. With, is it a good story? Does this actually make a good game, obviously, but within the context of the game, does it tell a good story? Does it immerse the player in a satisfying way? That, to me, is more important than doing something new that, it's never been done before. Sometimes these things haven't been done for a reason. But the other half of that within, as you say, long-running franchises especially is, and I think this applies to all fiction really, is to look for, this is how I approach it, look for the parts that haven't yet been explored. Now, sometimes that's literally a part of a game world that hasn't been explored. Sort of setting a campaign just in a remote corner of the map, for example, that sort of thing. Sometimes it's exploring an aspect of the game, an emotion or a sort of an aspect of the world building that hasn't been fully explored before. Sometimes it's about looking at characters who may have been secondary characters in a previous installment, bringing them back, putting them front and center. So again, this is all with the caveat that it still has to be a good story to be worthwhile doing. But assuming that you can do that, yeah, I try to look for, like I say, the things that haven't been touched upon, either because they've been, less important in the background, or they simply haven't been explored yet, whether that's a sort of physical, for want of a better word, part of the game world, or whether, like I say, it's an emotion or a sort of a state of action that hasn't been touched upon yet in the franchise. I mean, the canonical example of this is Alien to Aliens. Same world, same franchise, two very, very different movies, both great, but because Aliens was like, okay, well, we've done that. There's no point even trying to replicate the first movie. What hasn't been explored? And so, went in the other direction. There are many other examples, but that's the one that, everybody I'm sure is familiar with. So yeah, that's how I approach it, is look for that sort of that little niche, that opening for something that hasn't yet been explored.
And I guess it'd be tricky in Resident Evil since there have been more than a few games before. You might not have played every last one of them. Hopefully somebody on the team has, I guess. Did you
Just a
ever
few.
find yourself accidentally telling a story that had been in a previous one or contradicting and had to fix it?
Right, but that's why, like I said, overriding it all is it a decent story? That's more important than trying to do something brand new. And I will be the first to say the story, and obviously I did not come up with the whole of the Resident Evil 8 story by myself by any means. There was a whole team of people involved. I'll be the first to say it's not the most original story. It's not even the most original story in the Resident Evil franchise, but
it did have a big lady.
Oh, it did. That was original. The giant vampire lady was new, to everyone's delight. But what it was good. It was the right story for that installment at the time for a modern game that built upon the franchise and hopefully, sort of took it in a new direction. So again, it's you can't do these things in isolation. They have to all be looked at holistically. I know that's a buzzword, but it really is. You really do have to look at the whole thing and go, okay, well, this part's new, this part's not, but it fits, it works. So let's do it.
Right. Cool. I wanted to tap into Heather's background a little bit next, just to, related to sort of your specialty. You mentioned you've done a lot with the choice of games, franchise line, whatever you would call that. Obviously, those, for people that don't know, are like standalone stories, but all sort of using the same sort of interactive fiction like technology behind them, where you're like picking choices as you go through a prose story. And I was curious specifically, since you've done so much IF sort of work, do you find that there, because the game mechanics are the same every time, it's not like Resident Evil, which like has similar game mechanics but introduces new gameplay features and stuff like that. In IF, you're really just dealing with mainly the story is the new thing that's going to get someone to come experience that particular new one. Do you find that there's more emphasis on like, oh my God, I have to tell a completely original story that's different than all the other ones, and I can't rely on new game mechanics to carry the day? Or do you find that in like choice of games, for example, again, there's like expectations from such an established audience that you have to live up to in very specific ways?
So it's actually a little of both, which is very interesting. I feel like branching path, multiple choice, IF in particular, gives you this unusual opportunity to both set up and subvert expectations in the same body of work. So there's a little bit, I would agree with what Anthony said, that there's a degree to which you should be working within the framework you've got, that you shouldn't make changes just to make changes. It's got to be a good story first. And when you're working for Choice of Games does a lot of work that is grounded in the particular genre that's been identified. So like if the player / reader has come to you for a Regency romance, they're expecting a particular experience, and you should give them at least some of what they expect. But once you've grounded the work in the expectation, then you're free to subvert an expectation here and an expectation there, because the reader knows where they are and what's familiar. So for example, in A Study in Steampunk, which is the thing I was mentioning earlier, it is a Sherlock Holmes themed steampunk game. You do not actually play Sherlock Holmes characters, but they are transparent analogs, because I'm a huge Sherlock Holmes fan. And you can totally play it straight. Like, you can be Holmes and Watson, working for the established order, keeping the status quo. The Professor Moriarty analog is absolutely the bad guy, and you just have a very vanilla Arthur Conan Doyle experience, except there's also steampunk. But because you can make choices, you can also decide that, well, actually the government is corrupt and harmful, and this Professor Moriarty guy has a point and might even be the good guy on the board. So with the same setup, you can have this completely different, completely expectation subverted experience. And there's 2 more distinct paths and a bunch of variants in between, but I should stop talking in case somebody actually wants to play this and not have it all spoiled.
So did you, like, compared to working in other games, did you find it like more open to like that sort of like subversion and doing really different stuff working in IF versus working in, say, like Saints Row franchise you were mentioning on, or is it just too different to even compare?
I think generally speaking, working in indie gives you more freedom to do subversive things. So I think certainly working for like Choice of Games, I had much more creative control than some of the other things I've done for more established companies.
Right. And given creative control, you'll go for more surprises and subversion if you can.
Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. So then, speaking of indie people, I guess Zalavier, yes, I'm saying it correctly. You as you introed some of your games, you have games that are like very indie, like right down to their title, like an airport for aliens run by dogs, and Hypnospace Outlaw, and a space warlord organ trading simulator. Like, these are things that grab you as just sort of very off the wall, very unexpected, like from the get-go. Like, the entire setup is pretty out there. Then when you get into those games, do you find that you have to then just sort of ratchet it up and make it even more unexpected as you're going through the story to like keep up this high stakes of sort of shocking developments as you go? Or do you find that then once they're in, you have to ground it in something that's more like a conventional story?
I think there's also 2 bits to this equation. On the development side of things, I find that the fact that it's subversive, if anything, just keeps me interested, because I've worked on a lot of focused, or you could even say one-note experiences before. I love it. There is a particular satisfaction to having a brief and fulfilling it as best you can. But to give a example from a recent from an unannounced project that we'll be talking about very soon, it has Animal Crossing style characters interacting in a world. And it was just fine and wholesome, and I was bored to tears. I couldn't write it. It was hard to even work on it. The ostensible ideal and goal looked so nice and shiny, but there was no, if there's no hook for you as a developer, it can be hard to put yourself in the place of a player and say, well, why would people actually come to this game outside of, there's a market segment to be filled. So as soon as I broke out of the box that I had set for myself and said, the reason these characters are talking to you is because they robbed a bank 12 years ago and they're speaking to you in return for amnesty, so many things started to click, including just my passion for the project. here is something that I can write. Here's something to react against. Here's something that a player can engage with in a real way, and that I can engage with as a creator. The flip side of making very unusual games or games with these out there twists or premises is, especially when it comes to explaining it to stakeholders or potential publishers, that is a really weird sell, because what you're trying to do at that point is say, yes, this looks very weird, but there's a precedent for it. An Airport for Aliens Killing Run by Dogs is rooted in very established patterns from real life, including how you actually take a flight in real life, references and a shared shared genre space with works like the original Adult Swim things that came out, 12 Ounce Amounts and Aqua Teen Hunger Force and so on. Immersive sims and first-person adventure games. There's all of these precedents I could call upon and put into my deck, but because it was named An Airport for Aliens Killing Run by Dogs, and the entire point is interacting with stock photo dogs in an open world setting, none of that came through. People were like, it's so weird. And I'm like, no, it makes sense if you look at the different examples, but that appearance can be so blinding with weirdness that it eschews the possibility of understanding it within a standard framework. So I found subversive stories to be core to finding passion for projects, and core to sometimes the fundamental misunderstanding that these projects are very reasonable. It makes sense. My mom, dad, it makes sense that I'm spending my life doing this. I promise.
So you found that in those cases, like the crazy setting, of the airport or whatnot, was enough to hook you and get you excited, and then you could, work with fairly conventional game mechanics in the framework and sort of narrative mechanics in the framework of it, once you were excited by the concept. And then the flip is also true. The conventional setting leads to like, well, we got to do something. What about the bank heist? To like keep things interested. So it's like one or the other. Often, maybe sometimes it's both. Maybe sometimes both. They both need to be crazy.
To my eternal pain, I often decide to go straight into walking that line, because the fusion of those things is what makes me feel alive, for better and for worse.
No, here. I often, the reason I was interested in doing this panel is I found that, what it gets me excited about working in games is like, because it's such an immersive medium compared to like, linear media or something where you actually feel like you're into it, and players will come into it often expecting things in terms of mechanics or genre or whatever it is, that once you have them in there, you can spice things up in ways they don't expect, but you've already got them in there. Like if you're giving them enough of what they came there for, like, oh, it's a horror game and it does horror gamey things at the beginning, and then later you start introducing weirder stuff. Like, in my own game, The Suffering, we started off like, oh, it's a horror game set inside a prison. Got it. Like that's a good high concept hook that people say yes or no, I want to play that game. And then we gave them basically that for a while, and then we started introducing, we had conventional characters at the beginning that would, a guard who's mad at you, or like the prisoner who's into conspiracy theories about what crazy horror things are going on at this prison. And that's like, okay, cool, this is the game. And then like 2-3 hours in, we got to, oh, actually, this guard you meet, he's actually scared of everything. He's the guard who never should have been a guard, and then, oh, there's actually, this much later plot in the game is there's a slave ship that wrecked here 200 years ago, and that is part of the haunting that's going on. And people are like, I didn't know there was going to be that sort of stuff in this game. So, but by then they're in and they're ready to accept it. If we'd started with that, it might have been more like, what's this game I bought? This is not the horror game set in a prison I was promised. So it can be tricky. A story I like to tell about sort of like whether things in a narrative should be unexpected or not is there's a screenwriter friend of mine who was working on a project once, and he talked about, he was in a room with a couple of writers, like himself and his writing partner, I believe, and then like some producers were there, and they were talking about what they wanted to do with the story and how they wanted to make it different. And then one of the producers got up and wrote on the board, "Cliche is good." And told them, you shouldn't be pushing, there's a reason there's cliches. It's because everybody knows what they are, and we should put more of those in here. And, the writer's like, oh, but what? But I think there's like, I don't exactly agree with that statement, but there is a point where people like coming in for expected stories, like things that can feel grounded sometimes. I'm just wondering if anybody, feels that that's part of what you're doing. Maybe Anthony, you could start us off on this one of like, is that something you're thinking of as you're starting to like get the framework going, or as you're introing the game, like give them something familiar to start with, or how do you feel about that?
I think what you described, that you did with the suffering, is a great way to do that sort of thing. As you say, a lot of people will reject something that just sounds too weird and too out there to begin with. Not Zalavir's players, obviously, but many people will just, if they hear something that's too weird and too out there, they'll go, no, that's not for me. So it's a great way to draw them in, as you say, with conventions and tropes. And then subvert it, because then you can do something different, you can surprise them, and sometimes those are really profound experiences. Sometimes those are the things we remember the most, because we're in a genre we like. That's why the sort of conventional aspects drew us in, and then it flips something on its head, subverts something, and so we're already primed to enjoy it. And then if it's successful, it goes, whoa, blows our minds. So those can be really powerful, and they can be great if you can build them in. Where cliche and trope is good is, I think anyway, in emotional satisfaction for the player. And again, this is the same in other media as well, really. But in games, obviously, it's so much more resonant because of the immersion. I'm sorry, everybody's frozen. Can you still see me? Can you still hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
You're still good. But maybe
Oh dear.
actually.
Oh, and then he froze.
Oh,
and now we're not. Yeah.
The cruel
Another
person.
shocking development.
Hopefully we'll come back to Anthony shortly. Did anybody else want to say something about cliche or player expectations while we're waiting for him?
He said a lot of what I was going to say, actually, which was along the lines of, I don't think cliches are good, but I also don't think tropes are inherently bad. And I think a lot of people use the two words to mean the same thing. Whereas Anthony just said emotionally satisfying, right? We're kind of culturally primed for certain tropes. And we find the stories that tell them to be satisfying. And so you can use those to give the player enough of what they want that you can introduce something they weren't expecting, that they might not even have known that they would like better.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, go for it. It's all good.
I was just gonna say, and I'd say core to like my own understanding of that is that first off, embracing that cliche can be good was a core part of my development as a writer, going from I want to make the weirdest things ever to this nugget of practicality and a starting point for people to grab onto is essential to connecting to the wider cultural associations which allow us to have meaningful experiences with media. But the second major piece of that is also my favorite thing to embed in unexpected or premises or things that start off from a subversive angle is to then treat standard material and cliche material in a very emotionally honest and vulnerable way. An airport for aliens currently run by dogs looks like a very wacky thing. But when you start playing it, you realize almost immediately that it's actually this very vulnerable tale of a healthy long distance relationship between the last two human beings at the end of the world. And this ideal of, yes, we can have, our peanut butter and our chocolate, our cliche and our cliche or our standard premise, and this weirdness is what allows both of those things to land even more effectively, in my opinion. As much as I do love working on weird things, I don't think I would care about this game if it was just a meme, but instead having in that emotional roots in that standard progression of a relationship, and in the process of treating it honestly, saying to the player who connects with it, your feelings about this are valid. You connecting to this cliche is reasonable and good, and your care for this matters too, is something that I've come to really embrace.
Yeah. No, well said. I think there's, a lot of danger, I think, in just saying everything has to be weird here. We can't do anything conventional, because at some point you're just there's got to be. It's like the the game where you're like constantly jumping or doing some jetpack thing or flying through the air. Eventually you're like, oh my God, I landed on solid ground again. I can just take a moment and recover. And I think narratively you can sort of have that same feeling of like, oh, I just did the really weird thing. Oh, cool. The buddy character who I kind of know how they're going to be, and they kind of are like other buddy characters. Okay, I'm back to earth for a minute before we go do more weird stuff. Thinking of it sort of sometimes in that alternation could be important. I was curious too, I guess, in terms of the weirdness, and you can both maybe answer this one. Were you finding, Heather, maybe you could start, of like, were there expectations either like on the Choice of Games projects or maybe now in Saints Row, looking at like, oh, we want to tell a new story, but that's the one we just did 2 books ago in the Choice of Games, so it's too much like that other one, or in Saints Row, oh, we're really trying to do different things, so we can't do anything like the last Saints Row, it's all going to be different. Or even just, I've seen this on teams too, where you're working on it for a while and then some game comes out, or a movie or anything, but also often a game's like, oh my God, our story is too much like X thing that just came out. Now we got to change stuff to sort of avoid being too much like it.
The most frustrating thing in the world.
Sounds like
was there another game about aliens, dogs, and airports? I mean, I feel like you're pretty safe from that.
Pretty safe from that for some of my work, but for other things, especially working with clients, like having someone like smash into the team chat or the Slack and go like, oh my gosh, someone else is doing a similar story, or like our twist, and that being a reason to discard a story is one of the most frustrating things in the world. I'm sure you've dealt with that as well, especially on established projects.
Sure. I feel like, I don't know, there's an extent to which many stories in a genre are similar. Like there's some quote about there's only 7 original plots in the world, or 12 original plots, or something like that. Like, and there's a degree to which, like, for instance, a Regency romance has many of the same many of the same beats as every other Regency romance that you've ever read or played. And that's not inherently a bad thing. If it has like literally all the same beats, including the same twist, then perhaps you should go back to the drawing board. But similarity can be okay.
Yeah. So Andy, we moved on to the course. Glad to have you back, of course.
I'm so sorry about that. My internet just decided to collapse.
Oh, mine did that yesterday, and I was like, oh boy, is that my one for the week? I hope it doesn't happen tomorrow morning. Yeah, but glad to have you back. We were just talking about that experience of, often on a team, you'll be working on a plot and someone will say, oh no, that's just like this game that came out last year. Or even worse, you'll be in the middle of working on it and that game comes out or that movie comes out, could be multiple things. And then you find out that, oh, we have to change things because something has shifted. Or the flip side, Anthony, you may have heard of this. There'll be someone else on the team, like a producer or something, who is desperately in love with a thing that just came out and is asking you to make your story more like that. And you're like, oh, geez.
No, that never happens.
I shouldn't badmouth producers. This comes from creative directors as well, and all sorts of people. But anyway, all members of the team. So what's your been experience with that, and how do you deal with it when it comes up?
I think so. Actually, this ties back to what I was going to say before my internet got cut off. I mean, I agree with what I heard of the end of Heather's answer, that sometimes, the same is good because sometimes it's what your audience wants. And that's because I was going to talk about emotional resonance and emotional satisfaction from an audience. And that's where I think trope and cliche can be good. And, in a similar manner here, where if you can deliver the emotional satisfaction that an audience wants from the setup that you give them, from the stated premise that you begin with, if you can deliver, that will come with an emotional expectation from the audience. It might be subconscious. It's not necessarily something they're aware of, but they will have, your premise will set them up to expect some kind of an ending, some kind of a resolution. And if you can deliver that, that's the most important thing. How you deliver it isn't so important, I don't think. And that can be done by subverting what they're expecting. You know, the actual details of a resolution or a conclusion can be completely unexpected while still delivering the same emotional satisfaction that they do expect. And so that's what I look for when somebody comes to me with a comp and says, we want it to be like this. And I'm like, do you? Or do you actually just want to feel the same way you did
It's that.
when
Yeah.
you experienced that thing?
Yeah.
And if you can do that, now persuading those people that that's what they want rather than just a carbon copy can sometimes be tricky. But if you can persuade them of that, and then you can deliver, the same feeling they got from that prior experience,
Yeah.
then you have a win. I mean, look at the MCU, look at the Marvel movies. That's a great example. We have by now more than a dozen movies that are all kind of the same in their basic structure and plot, and yet the details are different enough that they don't, most people will go, oh no, they're totally different movies, different things happen and stuff. But the emotional resolution in almost all of those movies, apart from the big event team ones, but most of the solo hero movies that Marvel produces, the emotional resolution is basically the same in all of them, and yet they do it in different ways. And that's one of the reasons I think they're so successful. So again, that's what I look for, is to find the third way rather than doing exactly what somebody wants or completely rejecting what they want. Try and find a way to bring the two together in a way that, sort of doesn't compromise your own artistic integrity, but also delivers what people are expecting. That's a very political answer. Sorry.
Go ahead, Heather.
Just to piggyback off of that, because you brought up the Marvel movies, that I feel like that's a very good example of what I was saying before, or what we were both saying before, about grounding the experience in something familiar so that you can then subvert elements of it. Because I think Captain Marvel is a great example of that, because that is a single superhero story that actually doesn't follow the established mode, in that there isn't a villain with exactly comparable powers who needs to be defeated in a one-on-one battle at the very end. The movie goes out of its way to subvert that, and you sit there watching it and you're like, no, that's the right subversion for this story, for this moment. This tells you something new. And yet I feel as though I got what I came for, because it is grounded in all the other superhero tropes that make me feel warm and happy and satisfied.
Absolutely.
They changed just enough.
Yeah.
You're right. Xavier, did you want to come back to this? Yeah, go for it.
No, I was actually going to ask you how you felt about this sort of grounding with things like the Church in the Darkness, because starting from this basis that's getting a lot of attention, especially lately, of cults and true crime, especially with the 70s, I'm interested in how you approached making that story and then making it so that people could play it over and over again.
Yeah, thanks. That's was sort of my whole point, and it's sort of the point of all the games I do, is like setting up a thing that, oh, you think you know what this environment's going to be like, but then you get there and it isn't like that exactly. And again, sometimes that disappoints some players who are like, but I wanted them to just be evil cartoon characters that I could go shoot or something. And you're like, well, sorry. But yeah, I think for that game, I got really fascinated by that. And I think this is a great source for all writers of like, I saw a documentary about a cult group that sort of revealed like what the members of it were thinking, and realizing that they weren't all just brainwashed and they weren't all just, like just total maniacs or something like that, which is often what we think as outsiders of a group like that. And then as you talk to these people, like, well, we thought this was a great new religion, we thought this was a great political movement, we thought it was this stuff, and then by the time we realized it was bad, we were already in, and all our friends are there, and how are we going to get out, and all this stuff. And just that was so fascinating to me, as like, you don't join a cult on purpose, right? You get sucked in by this other stuff. So then it was, how do I get people to go in to play this game thinking, oh, I'm going to go save someone from a cult, and then you get there and realize, oh, maybe the cult isn't so bad, or maybe it is, I can't tell. And then that was the hook of the narrative changing every time, was part of paying off the subversion, which was, it's hard to tell if the cult is bad or not. And to hear some people who've played it, it wasn't different enough on the different threads, and it's very hard to make a procedural story that really changes in big ways, without like ranking up like tons and tons of more content. If you've got voices to do and cutscenes and stuff like that, it just kind of gets out of control. But that was sort of the whole point of that game. And I just find that usually as you're in the research phase of working on your project, you're like, oh, cool, this is a game set in X. I always look for what's the research about that subject that isn't well known, that hasn't been broadcast in other adaptations of this before. What's this one person who was in this thing, whatever it could be, who was like actually the opposite of what you would expect, just to show that situations are complicated for humans, right? It's often not that exact thing.
And isn't that what I said at the start about finding the part of something that hasn't been explored yet?
Right.
It's, it works. If you can find something there that is interesting, as you say, some aspect that is buried in the research that hasn't been exploited in other media before, that's,
right.
If you can make a good game and story out of that, that's gold.
Yeah.
It occurs to me that there's a really interesting question here, which is, how do you find that point of divergence that hasn't been explored? How do you research this unexpected thing? I'd be really interested to pose a question to the group of just like, how do you do your research, for example, Heather, for things like a study in steampunk, and and find something unexpected to hang your hat on inside of a well-trodden territory?
This feels like a little bit of a non-answer, but studying steampunk in particular, I had a plot bunny idea. Like there was a particular subversive thing that I wanted to do. I'm pretty well read in the like Sherlock Holmes pastiche genre, and I'd never seen it. I thought it was going to be a book. And then I realized the most interesting aspect of it was how it compared to the more typical experience of that kind of story. And that's when I realized it needed to be a game, so that all the different parts of it could be explored. So you could play it straight and play it subverted in a couple different ways. So I guess in this particular case, I trusted my own instincts, and nobody said they'd seen it before. So I was right. Could have gone the other way.
But you knew that because you were well read in the genre.
Yeah, because it's my particular, hobby.
Oh, no. Certainly for me.
Oh, there he is. You blinked for a second. You're back now.
Oh, good. Good.
Yeah. No, overall, I think that is the general answer to Zalvir's question, is to be well read in whatever you're trying to find the new aspect of. Because if you don't know a genre or a medium or a format, if you're not well versed in it, you won't know what's new. You'll come up with something and think nobody's done this before, and then people who are well versed in it go, oh no, actually half a dozen people have already done that. And that again doesn't necessarily make it bad, but it means that you're not going to be exploring new and unique territory. And I think that's vital. We see it in like how many science fiction and fantasy authors, books do we see come along that are clearly written by people who aren't that well read in the genre and think they're inventing something brand new, but actually they're just reinventing the wheel. Those genres for some reason seem to be very prone to it, and annoys me. But yeah, you have to know your genre, your medium, your field in order to know whether something's been done before.
That explains why I see my friends who make visual novels and people who I know who consume a lot of visual novels hate so many things that are like, oh, we're making a visual novel parody, or here's like our visual novel April Fool's joke, because it's the medium already has so much of a culture and language to itself that there's for people who come in and think that they know what it is, they often aren't reinventing the wheel.
Yeah, it's interesting. There is a line, I think, of like consuming sometimes too much of the medium that you're into, almost of like, because I've definitely met those people who are like so into this specific thing that they create something that's very carefully in a space that has never been done at all. And then as a result, like it can't reach a bigger audience because it's in such a specific thing.
Yeah.
It also has no appeal to people outside of
Right,
that
right.
same
You're hitting those
promotion. Yeah.
super fans because they'll be like, "Oh my God, it's finally the new thing out of the 1,000 science fiction novels published in the last 12 months, or whatever." But sometimes those people can just get so into the genre, it's hard to be bigger. The other thing for me, we were talking about research and how we do that. I always try to have, I feel like when you do research on any subject, there's like the big popular books on the subject, popular website, popular documentary, and you got to see those first as a starter, but that's just step one. And then you got to go find the more obscure documentary that's like harder to find, that wasn't as popular, that tells you the other side of it. Or, I love, doing something set in a location, traveling to that location myself, meeting people from that location, interviewing them, because that's where you get the really different stuff, is the things that nobody else has written about before. So it has to involve leaving your desk in some form when the pandemic allows us to do that. But
yeah, you say to those people, what do you wish people talked about your hometown or whatever that nobody ever talks about? What is the thing you wish people did talk about? You can find some really interesting things out that way.
Totally. And I guess we're getting near the end of our time. I just wanted to do a quick go round of, part of the title of the panel is subverting expectations. And I've said that for me, like, I always want to do that. Like, that's sort of my reason. And I'm just curious, how important do you all think it is in terms of like in your own work? Is that what gets you out of bed in the morning to do that every project? Or sometimes you're just happy doing, you not have to be actually subversive with your work? Heather, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I like a lot of old-fashioned stuff. I've mentioned both Sherlock Holmes and Regency romances, which means a lot of the established tropes are actually pretty harmful. So I'm not comfortable regurgitating them without thinking about it. Usually there's something I want to subvert very much. And so that's why I'm there to use the tropes that I don't think are harmful and are emotionally satisfying so that I can subvert the ones that are.
Cool. Anthony, do you want to go?
Subverting expectations per se isn't what sort of motivates me and gets me out of bed, if you like. My focus, I've said it before, is always about just telling a good story. But part of telling a good story and being entertaining for me is not repeating myself and not repeating what other people have done. So I don't know, to me, I don't feel like I'm subverting expectations, but I do kind of go against the grain in a lot of my work. I will deliberately go, okay, well, this is not how things are normally done. So what if I did do them? Can I still make that a good, entertaining story, game, screenplay, whatever? And it doesn't always work. But it's where a lot of the interesting stuff can be found, I think. I don't know. Does that qualify as subverting expectations? I'm not sure it does. Maybe for the purposes of this panel, we'll allow it. I don't know.
For official professional purposes, I am totally not subversive, and I should continue to be employed by everyone.
Yeah, you should continue to hire me. Yeah.
Xalavier, what's your thought?
Yeah, my thought here is actually kind of in tune with what Heather said. I'm becoming deliberately more comfortable with working with expectations and trope and cliche spaces, because Arthur Conan Doyle stories and the Regency stories in particular, those are places where people like me have not been visible as pieces of the genre, despite being massive fans or being a critical part of the spread of the genre. So one of the next things I'm working on is a straight up spiritual successor to Max Payne. It's called El Paso Elsewhere. You can wishlist it now on Steam. And a huge part of the reason I was working on that is I kept thinking about, like, what dimensions would Max Payne take on with these differing approaches if we brought in more of the supernatural, if we brought in, for example, black protagonists. And finally I was like, even if I worked on Max Payne, I would never be able to do this. So why don't I just make it myself?
What was the name of that again? Because that sounds like my sort of thing.
El Paso Elsewhere, right? Did I get it right?
You got it. Absolutely. You could have gotten all of the titles of my games right, which none of my interviewers have. This is kind of distressing.
We're sweating bullets all night long, man. No. All right, I think we need to wrap up for sure. Can I do a quick lightning round of where people can be found on the internet if you want to be found on the internet, websites, Twitter handles, whatever. Heather, why don't you go?
My Twitter handle is my first name and my last name. I am not on Twitter a whole lot these days, but it's not a terrible way to reach me. And my website, which is also my first name and my last name, is down for repairs. So that's a completely unhelpful answer. But by all means, check out the game I mentioned that's available on Steam, and then send me an email and tell me if you liked it.
Study in Steampunk. All right, Anthony.
Yeah, same. My social media handle, especially with the way my name is spelled, is just my first name, last name. It's ANTONYJOHNSTON. If you spell it correctly, you will find me on the internet, because there aren't that many people out there who spell it that way. My website is anthonyjohnson.com. My Twitter is /AnthonyJohnson, etc., etc. So yeah, that's where you'll find me.
Awesome. And Zalvir?
At Rit Nelson on Twitter and on TikTok, WRIT Nelson. But also, if you type up Zalvir, much like other folks on this panel, you will find me.
Cool. Yes, I'm also slightly Googleable, particularly if you add the third to it. I was delighted to have another person with a place name after their last name on this session. You can find me on Twitter at Richard Rouse III, or check out paranoidproductions.com for my stuff, or farbridge.com for my current stuff. And then check out Church in Darkness, also on sale for LudoNarraCon. So thanks, everybody. It's been a great chat. We could talk for much longer, but they won't.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you
Take
so
care,
much.
folks. Been a delight.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.